isn't part of free speech or the First Amendment the right of redress?
That is correct, to petition the government, exactly.
And petitioning the government has been widely considered to be including to make cases before the federal court when you believe that the Constitution is being violated or your free speech is being violated or due process is being violated. Those are all consistent with what we would broadly say is the First Amendment.
Correct.
And for the record, the First Amendment, incredibly short, and if we read it in its purest sense, you would say that Congress shall make no laws respecting. And that because it only says Congress, that it doesn't apply to anyone else. Have our courts, including our Supreme Court under 200 plus years, have they ever considered it that narrow?
No, Congressman.
So isn't it true that they basically consider censorship of free speech very broadly to include intimidation by federal, state, or local government authorities? Isn't that right?
Yes, intimidation and retaliation, among many other things.
So what was earlier called suggestion by the federal government, the vast power of the federal government, which could even include the IRS, one might think in this case, that kind of suggestion has historically been viewed as intimidation consistent with this relatively short statement about our right of free speech.
That's exactly right. There's overwhelming evidence in our case that contradicts the notion that these were mere suggestions from federal officials. It's completely factually baseless to state that.
So you earlier testified that the vast majority of this was one-sided and came from government officials who wanted to take down things which disagreed with the government in place at that time, which happened to be the government of Joe Biden, correct?
Correct.
So what we really have here is something similar to historically Nixon v. the IRS, if you remember that era, and that's not the actual case name, but what you have is the power of the executive branch being used to reduce the opposition or the redress or the free speech or the communication of people who might disagree with what was being put out by the executive branch, which happened to be a Democrat president.
That's exactly right. We see not just interference with free speech, but interference with the attempts to organize for political advocacy.
Now, is this an opinion, or are these indisputable facts based on the literally millions of events?
Yeah, the evidence is overwhelming, and we've submitted extensive evidence to the subcommittee.
So what we're dealing with here is tangible evidence that the other side of the aisle seems to want to talk around about the changing of what would have been public opinion if public opinion were freely allowed to occur without intervention by the federal government and, candidly, agents on behalf of them, including private entities that were paid to be part of this program.
That's correct, and you do see a concerted effort to change the subject.
So I would like to use the remainder of my time to give you an opportunity to speak to some of the personal attacks that were just made on you, if I could.
Very briefly, I would note that all the questions that came from the other side there were misleading in the way they were characterized. They mislead my involvement. There's no suggestion that anything I did was before the 2020 election was inappropriate or involved a misuse of state resources. I categorically deny that. It is false. That is misinformation. However, I recognize the member's right to say misinformation because you know what? That's protected by the First Amendment, contrary to what Mr. Seligman is suggesting in his testimony.